Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining in with us. Today, we're going to be talking about order and chaos, and this is going to be part of a series, probably three parts. I don't know. Might be longer, might be shorter. When Dinah and I get together, we talk way too much, and we're going to try to compress it down and make it fun and exciting and interesting for you. And why we're doing this today is that Dinah has an amazing new book that just came out, and it is called, I gotta look, sorry, I gotta cheat because I don't want to mess up the name of the title. Because I think I actually, the first time I posted something about it, I messed up the title, and Dina was like, "You messed up the title." And then I fixed it, and you're like, "You still messed up the title." The book is called The Greatest Exodus, A Divine Warrior Tradition. Can you give us a little brief synopsis of what this book is about?
Well, that will be a challenge in 25 words or less. Basically, I took the theme of combat myth, which is quite prevalent in the ancient world, and I overlaid that, the Exodus and the gospel story, and even into Revelation. So basically, you have a divine warrior who rises up, defeats a chaos enemy, and because he wins the battle, he gets a temple. And then there's a whole procession, proclamation, heralds announce the great victory, and there's an enthronement of the divine warrior, and then a covenant meal that's sort of associated. It's kind of 8 parts that go with it. And really, I tried to, excuse me, fit the entire Exodus into this pattern, and it fit very nicely. And then I went into the Gospels, particularly Matthew, and the same pattern fit. And Yeshua, of course, as the divine warrior extraordinaire, and then took that same pattern and overlaid it in the book of Revelation. So it's just this combat theme myth through a figure called the divine warrior who brings about the restoration and order through his enthronement and his deliverance through the battle.
I was a little bit surprised when I first started reading the book because we've talked a lot about this idea of the new or greater Exodus, and I've done stuff in the past about it, and I've really focused in on it more from the angle of the ongoing exile and the pattern that we see from like the book of Daniel and just everything around that, whereas you took on this completely different angle of order and chaos and the combat myth. And I want to really quickly point out for our audience the word myth here, because every time people hear the word Bible and myth, they kind of tighten up and they're like, I get to defend the Bible. The word myth is not always tied to the idea of an untrue story. Myth, and I love this definition of it, it's a story that a community tells itself over and over again to set a sense of identity
Right.
within them. It creates identity. So it can be true. It doesn't necessarily have to be true, but it's something that sets in motion an identity for the community.
That's sort of groundbreaking for the ancient world. Everything was about identity. Like that was one of the highest
Mhm.
values in the ancient world. So through myth and storytelling, creating that identity for them was everything.
Yeah. And that's why I like to talk about like the Torah cycle as being myth, not in that the story is untrue, but it's something that the Jewish community has retold themselves over and over again on an annual basis for thousands of years, and it's created a source of identity. So kind of the same thing for the Christian community. The Gospels have become myth. It's a founding story that is retold over and over and over again that gives you that sense of identity.
Yeah.
So,
I tell people too, you need to understand it as just another language. If you're learning French or English, I mean, Spanish or whatever, uh, myth is a language that you need to kind of learn and learn to think in. And it basically is telling you a real life story with real people, persons, places, things, etc. But it's using language that's uncomfortable to us, but more symbolic type language. But it doesn't mean it's not true. It's just told in a different style. And it's very difficult for us because as of Middle Ages, everything mythological is put in the box of fiction and for quaint primitive peoples. But if we can have an appreciation for it, those stories and the purpose of those stories and what comes out through those stories to give them their identity and the structure of their community.
Yeah, and that's key for anyone who's reading literature. You've got to understand when people are writing a story, especially a true story, you can write about all sorts of things. It's like when someone reports the news. You've got CNN reporting the news and you got Fox reporting the news, and they can report the same story and they can both provide facts, but they can write a completely different narrative.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Because it's what you choose to present, it's how you choose to frame it that tells the story. And I think that's key for us to helping us understand the Bible, is that the Bible is not just reporting the facts only for the purpose of the facts. It's people who are writing to tell us a story for the purpose of informing us of something greater than. They're trying to convict us of something. And so by understanding their language, as you mentioned here, this idea of combat myth, it helps us to better understand what they're trying to communicate to us, and helps us to avoid assuming things and making the text out to be something that they're not actually communicating to us.
Well, and again, it's not our world, so I get it. I mean, we are oriented to a scientific world, with facts and scientific reports and manuals. We figure out stuff. So, we continue to try to help folks. And do we understand it perfectly? Of course not. But we keep trying to help folks understand that ancient culture, so that when you have an understanding of what the Bible's saying, then you can move forward and make your application for today in a modern world. Like, how is that going to apply to me? We don't ever want to leave it in the ancient world, but we feel it is our duty to help whomever see this in the context that it was written. So myth becomes very important. And as we've been talking about, combat myth is just one element. I mean, we have creation myth stories, we have flood stories, we have sea monster stories, and the combat myth. So all of those were quite popular, and how the ancients formed their world. And so we're going to take, as we're discussing this, we see how God has taken these things and radically changed them, but he still used the culture of the time.
And I want to highlight something that you said there. You talked about us having a scientific worldview, and that is so key, because even if we don't think of ourselves as having that, we all have that. When we think about objects, we think about them from their material properties.
Yeah.
And it's very hard to break away from that. But the reality is, and what really helped me out, there's a book, I started reading it. It's a really hard read. I'll openly admit it's Jordan Peterson's Maps of Meaning. But he talked about this, and he broke it down how we in the modern, especially Western world, we focus so much on the scientific worldview that focuses on material origins and material this, that, and the other. I think John Walton actually talks about this too in this book, The Lost World of Genesis 1. But the scientific world view doesn't assign meaning to anything. Like, you can know all about an object, but it doesn't tell you at all what it means to someone.
Right.
And so simply understanding that God created the world doesn't mean anything. Like, whether it was God creating it or random chance, like, people argue over that all day and night, right? Evolution versus creation. But neither one of those debates get to, okay, what does it mean? What are the implications of these things? And that's really what we should be worrying about. And that's what the ancient world focused in on. They didn't really care as much. They assumed that God or the gods created the world, but that's not what they were interested in. They were interested in, okay, if this God created the world, what does that mean
Right.
for our life today?
Well, and the writers were always, they didn't feel the need to fill in all the gaps, and so their goal, we're trying to uncover their interpretation, their message, their meaning of what they're saying behind the narrative and the story that they're given. I think in the ancient world, talk about mountains and trees and stuff. I mean, for me, I was a skier. I look at a mountain and I'm, looking for snow. And, I've got a mountain right in front of me. It's all craggy rocks and, there's no trees on top. And, I can describe it all to you, but the ancients never saw a mountain that way. The mountain was considered this first fixed point of stability as in the creation process. It was the place that connected heaven and earth. The top of the mountain was the location of the temple and the gods and the kings being enthroned, etc. So that was the meaning. This contrast between in the world order, the kings, etc., on the top of the mountain, the folks at the bottom needing a mediator to access it. Meanwhile, I'm looking at the mountain wondering if there's nice fresh powder snow so you can, go skiing. We just don't have, it's very difficult for us to see it in those terms. So we're hoping here at least to start, especially in Genesis 1, because I think one of the most foundational concepts we've talked about is chaos and order. I mean, that is like in the first verses. And I think because we see them as a binary choice, bad, good, but it's much deeper and much broader than that. So I think we'll probably try to establish the foundation with that, because that's going to be the hallmark of the Bible.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to draw a little bit from some notes I took before the show, because I, and I'll freely admit it, I used to throw out the words order and chaos, and I always looked at them as these like binary, like order is good and chaos is bad because chaos sounds bad. But when you actually get into the study of the theory behind it and the psychology, it's actually not that. So I'm going to define it and give a couple little of my notes here, and then we can talk a little bit more through it. So order represents structure and stability, whereas chaos represents change, unpredictability, but also the potential for growth. And that's key because life requires a balance. If you have too much order, the system becomes brittle, and too much chaos, and the system is going to collapse. If you have the right amount of order, you're going to have peace and calm. But if you have too much order, you end up in a system of oppression and people end up in depression. On the other side, that chaos, that unknown, that unexpected, if you have the right amount of chaos, it's the place that breeds creativity and opportunity. But too much chaos is going to create anarchy and anxiety.
That's good. Well, and it brings me to, just talking about the mountain. So this first fixed point that comes out of the waters as a point of stability and order, like it's the first uh, element that is associated with order. And you contrast that with chaos that the ancients associated with the seas, because it's this constantly changing thing, like it's not a stable structure. So you can see why, with the definitions you just gave, why they would associate those elements with those two things. Now, the seas are obviously not bad. We fish, we
Yeah.
eat out of them, etc. And so I think that's a point well taken. And I think when you look in Genesis 1, most scholars would assume that sort of pre-creation state not being as chaos evil, but a disordered state, a non-existent state, a state that's ready to be made into something. It has the potential to become something, and then we go through the creation week, in Genesis 1. So God's not viewing it that way, but like we've been saying here, as humans, we just have to put things in boxes, and it's either in a nice, good box or it's in a bad box. But life isn't that. There's just a lot of gray and a lot of mixture between the two. And I think we could put ourselves in a dangerous position by just taking these sort of strong stances and saying, everything is this or everything is that, because that's not how life operates.
It's been blowing my mind the last couple of weeks when I started thinking about that tohu vabohu state, that formless and void state, not as being something bad, but being untapped potential.
I like that.
I think you use that word. Use the word potential, but I like to kind of throw the word untapped potential in front of it. Now, if you take that concept and you look at other times where God acts upon chaos, it's chaos, but it's also untapped potential. You think about the nations. The nations are oftentimes likened to being the seas, right, in the Bible. And so if we take the notion that chaos is bad, then the nations must be bad. But I don't think that's what God is saying. He's saying that the nations are untapped potential, that if God's order can be instituted upon them, then they can bring forth life, just like the Garden of Eden.
Yeah.
Like you've got this like awesome picture here right in Genesis 1, not of God. We always want to say, creating something out of nothing, right? Ex nihilo creation, but something even more powerful is going on than that. He's taking untapped potential and creating from that. Now, of course, the ancients would have believed that he brought everything out of nothing at some point in time, but that's not what Genesis 1 is talking about.
I think it's the nature of the radicalness of God's order. And we talked earlier about the concept of chaos has evolved. What it meant in the Genesis chapter 1 and what God was doing is one thing, but you can see it just evolving over time. And now we're, millennia, and it's it's a word that gets thrown around a whole lot now because we feel like we're living in a time of absolute chaos. There's not a better word to describe where we are, but we've sort of lost the essence of what it meant in the beginning. And so I think it's good for us to start back then to see that God was always doing something radical. He always had a radical alternative to the structure of the world around them, and all these ancient empires and stuff. And we'll talk a little bit, of course, about their creation stories and how different, the creation story of Yahweh was. Like his view of humanity is transformational compared to the view that the gods had of humanity in the ancient world. So I just think we need to be cognizant that this concept has evolved over time, the idea of chaos and what it meant in the beginning and what it means to us now.
Before we jump into the other nations and their creation stories and how that the Bible interacts in that environment, you said something there that I want to jump into a little bit. You talked about the order provided by the other nations. And we're actually, this is going to tie because the creation myths of the other nations were essentially their propaganda or their justification for the order that they imposed. Yeah. So we'll get into that. So hold on to that, everyone. But think about this. Egypt was a land of order. They had when we go back and we look at our definition of order, structure and stability. Yes, people were being oppressed, but they were being oppressed within a very ordered system. And this is the thing, is that when you have too much order, oftentimes you have a totalitarian or fascist regime in place. It's a government that is so oppressive because they control every aspect of life. And when you look at the Exodus narrative, how they start off, they have a lot of their own autonomy, like they have their own elders, their own things, but they live within the structure where they cannot even imagine breaking out of it. I mean, you've got Moses who kills an Egyptian who's beating a Hebrew slave, and what do they want to do? The Hebrews essentially want to report Moses. Like they can't break out of their ordered system. You don't do this. Like this, the way that the world functions is we are the slaves, they are the masters, they beat us, you don't fight back. It was perfect order.
Well, I think what we have to remember too is, and as we'll again talk about the creation stories, but those stories were the creation of the state, not the creation of the universe and humanity. And so, tied to the creation of the state is essential to create an environment of order to keep everything in place. And as you say, as you keep forcing order and more order and more order, you end up on the other side into totalitarianism. But the Babylonian creation myth was about the creation of the Babylonian state, not about humanity. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, to your point there.
So when you look at the Exodus narrative, you've got the state, which has an established order, and Yahweh is actually the chaos bringer in the story.
Yes, he does.
He's the one who's destroying the order, right?
Right.
He's breaking down the order of the gods with the 10
Yes.
plagues. He leads Israel through the sea. He takes them into the sea, right? And then so the two places that were associated the most with chaos were the sea and the wilderness, because both were unstructured areas. They were uninhabitable areas. And so he takes them through the sea into the wilderness.
And it's exactly the same
Um,
route with Yeshua. God takes him into the wilderness to defeat the chaos creature, and then he takes him up to the Sea of Galilee. And all of the same things go on. That's exactly right.
when you understand the proper definitions of order and chaos, it suddenly flips the script, and you realize that it's not about just chasing order. It's about having this proper balance, and sometimes you need to bring, God needs to bring chaos in order to disrupt the order, and then he reestablishes new order. And that's what we see with like the giving of the commandments, the setting up of the tabernacle, and things like that. He needed to do that, but he had to first break down the old order, create chaos, create that untapped potential in order for new order to be able to arise from
Well,
that.
and certainly, like the plagues are like the best example because he goes in and uses everything that's Egypt against them. It's like reverse engineering. He takes all the gods of Egypt that are in the elements of all the plagues and just forces it back on them because they look to their pharaoh to maintain order in the Egyptian empire. I mean, he was responsible for that, and now they're looking to him and going, Houston, we got a problem here. There's all this the order that is out of these gods is now turned into chaos. You see this sort of play here going on, and then of course, like you say, as God leads them through the sea on dry land, elements of order again, to this sort of great enthronement at the mountain and the construction of the tabernacle. But God is always in the business of upending the status quo or the current comfort zone with some kind of radical alternative to what the nations are, what makes them comfortable and secure. He just upends and turns it upside down.
So with that in mind, let's shift back to our creation account and talk about that, those creation stories of the other nations. And I really liked what you said about specifically the Babylonian myth. I think that probably the Babylonian creation myth is probably the most studied one.
Yeah.
That's probably why everyone goes there. And it was called Enuma Elish. It was something that was publicly recited on the Babylonian New Year's festival, which was called the Akitu Festival. It featured a new young god, Marduk, who rises to power and defeats Tiamat. And Tiamat was this sea dragon who represented chaos. And then he uses Tiamat's carcass to order the cosmos, like divides up her carcass, creates heaven and earth out of it, and all of that. And what was interesting is that this story essentially rewrote the earlier and older Mesopotamian creation stories that featured other gods, such as like Enlil as
Right.
being the supreme deity. And now you have Marduk instead. So it mirrors Babylon's political takeover of that region.
Exactly, exactly. So there's two things. All of the other creation myths begin in violence. And that, that we have to be aware. God is, is never the God of violence, and he brings order through breath, word, language, etc. But all these other creation myths start in violence. And there's a number of things that you find in all of these creation myths of how the one God defeats another or takes control. So trampling is a word that's often used for that. Splitting, binding, chaining, separating, all of these words or all these concepts were ways that that their creation stories came into vogue. And so you see in the Marduk Tiamat thing, there was the splitting, right? It was a violent action. He murders her, takes a sword, splits her, half her body goes to the waters above and the other half to the waters below. So whenever you see language like that of trampling and splitting and binding and chaining, you know that comes forth out of violence, and it is generally connected to some sort of new creation thing for the nations. It's very interesting.
And so your book is about the divine warrior
Right.
tradition. So we've got, and you've already talked about this combat myth. Um,
So
and it's
this is a
interesting
combat myth.
because
The Marduk Tiamat is a perfect example of a combat myth in the ancient world. And Marduk wins, and he gets a temple and, placed in the center of Babylon, and on they go.
yeah. And so you contrast before we get into any of the other stories. Let's go back and let's just focus on the creation, the comparison of the creation accounts. Genesis 1 and 2 compared to Enuma Elish. And we have to do that because we've got to realize Genesis 1 wasn't written in a vacuum. It was written to people who grew up and lived in a world where Enuma Elish and other various creation myths existed. There was in Egypt, they had different creation myths as well. And like you said, they all featured these violent battles with one god finally winning out and taking over the cosmos through violence.
Can I just
And
say something
so,
before I forget? Well, if
yeah,
we have to remember that Israel was in Babylon for 70 years, and most of them more than 70 years. So that Neo-Babylonian creation myth of the state of Babylon is certainly going to seep into their thinking and their observation. And so the Bible is written post Babylonian exile. You got to figure there's a filter there, and now they're rewriting or taking the oral Genesis story. So that's going to kind of figure in there too.
yeah, and went down a whole
I know.
different rabbit
Sorry.
trail there. For those who want a little bit of context there's a lot of thought around it. I talked a lot to my professor about it. There are some people who believe that the Bible was completely written in Genesis. There's also, whether it was written in Babylon or whether it was edited in Babylon, right? And you can actually see the hand of the editor. I think that's very clear. You see in I forget where it is, but Abraham, he chases them as far as Dan,
Mhm.
which was a city that didn't exist until the tribe of Dan. And then you see later on in the book of Deuteronomy where they talk about no one to this day knows where Moses was buried.
Right.
And that would be a really weird statement if Moses himself wrote that.
Right.
Little bit less weird, but still equally weird if Joshua wrote it.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
there's some hints that these stories were either passed down orally or perhaps written down and at least edited in Babylon. And so, yeah, when we talk about the Babylonian creation myths, and remember, Abraham came from Babylon as well, right? So these are all these things. And so when we talk about comparing Genesis to the Babylonian myth, just because they were in Egypt doesn't mean that it's invalid to compare it to the Babylonian myths. We could equally, though, compare it to the various Egyptian creation myths. They did the same thing, and it was interesting. I was reading about this. Each time a different city held dominance in Egypt, that city, for example, when Memphis was the capital of Egypt, the god Ptah
Mhm.
was emphasized as the creator, and then when it changed to Thebes, Amun was the
Right,
central
right.
deity in their creation myth. So they all did this at some level because again, it was political
And
propaganda.
I would mention, just as an aside, because the representative of Ptah was the Apis bull, which makes me wonder, is that, is that the golden calf imagery? Is that because the Ptah was the creator god of Egypt in that period? So just food for thought.
Yeah, yeah. And then they go into the land of Canaan, where they had the same sorts of things. You had the Baal combat myth,
Right.
where Baal fights Yam,
Hmm.
which was the
Hmm.
sea, reinforcing Baal's role as the storm
Yeah.
god. Like this wasn't just, oh, Babylon did this and everyone else. Like this was across
Right.
the ancient world. This is how people thought, and this is why, in my opinion, like we can be 98.5% sure that Genesis is interacting with these stories because everyone was doing it. Genesis isn't copying. Like people sometimes say, "Oh, well, Genesis was just copying these stories." No, it grew up in this environment, right? It's like today if I released a superhero movie that I made up all on my own, I'm not copying Marvel or DC or whatever other companies there are out there that like we today our stories often feature superheroes.
Yeah.
That's just how we tell stories about people accomplishing great things is through people having superhuman powers. Back in the day, that's how they told stories was through these creation
Well, and
accounts.
I would add too, every ancient culture had a storm god, and the storm god was essentially their divine warrior. So in the Baal Yam battle, Baal was considered to be the storm god, and through the
Mm,
story, he's resurrected. I mean, it again,
that's a
the culture is important to see what's going on there. What were you going to say?
And well, and I was just saying that's interesting then because you see, I done I read a book that had a study on this. The term "the coming of the Lord" or "the day of the Lord" and "the coming of the Lord" it's tied to it's not about like a future singular event. The coming of the Lord or the coming of the Lord on the with the clouds of heaven, like those two phrases are oftentimes interchangeable. That's whenever God enters into judgment on a local city. It always talks about him coming on the clouds. Coming on the clouds is like this idea of him coming into local judgment. So it's carrying, like you just said there, this storm god motif, not copying, but that was just they use the idea of storms as
Yeah.
judgment, and so therefore you would write the language of Yahweh judging the Babylonians for their wickedness in terms of a
Right.
storm.
And
I like
I
it.
mean, it shows up in the Gospels. I mean, we see storms out on the sea with Yeshua who's sleeping in the boat, right? And then Yeshua walking on the waters and Peter attempting to imitate. I mean, this all go. I'm not saying it didn't happen. I'm just saying the context for it is the storm god having rulership over the seas and over nature and having control over that world.
Yeah, you're it's to go back to the because everyone gets hung up when I know when people explain it in this thing, it's not a debate over whether or not it happened. It's why was it important for it to happen to begin with, and why was it important out of all of the miraculous things that happened with Jesus, as Luke points out, I think it was Luke. He said something like it would fill volumes and volumes
Right.
to record all the deeds. Why this one in particular? Why did that get recorded?
Yeah.
It's because it has specific meaning. And that's our job, is to try to understand what was the meaning, not try to debate over whether or not something happened that no one can prove.
Yeah, exactly. And again, it goes back to, Yeshua having dominion and sovereignty over the nations, because the seas and the nations were synonymous essentially by that time. So yeah, there's always this greater message behind it. And I don't think we can really get to the message unless we understand how it was all birthed, in Genesis chapter 1. And we were going to talk a little bit about sort of the comparison between would just take the Babylonian creation myth and the Genesis story. And I would just, the main point I would have in that is this concept of splitting and separation. So the splitting for the Marduk story again, is a violent experience here. And yet the entirety of Genesis chapter 1 has everything splitting, heaven and earth, light and dark, day and night, uh, Eve from Adam, land from sea. It's this whole process of splitting where normally in for those cultures that is not a good thing. Like that is the defeat of one over another. But this kind of splitting or this separation between these elements is all a covenantal design, which in the ancient world, you didn't have that kind of covenantal relationship with your God, for sure. And so this is just a beautiful pattern, starting out with the 7 words, in Genesis 1:1. So that God has turned the splitting that normally leads to this other state into something beautiful, and always about humanity.
Yeah, and the other thing with that too is how he does it. He does it through, not through
Right.
violence, but through his spoken word. It's simply a desire, an action, a command, and it happens. Whereas in all of the other nations, at least in every creation myth that we can find, it's always done through coercive
Right.
violence. And when we understand that all of those stories were functioning as political propaganda to prop up the state, to legitimize their authority, what is that doing? It's basically teaching people that the state has the right to violently react against you if you oppose the
Yep.
state. Right? It justifies an authoritarian state that says, if you come against us, we will kill you because we are the ones who created order.
And look, that's the
And
sum
that's
total of Yeshua's life. He did exactly that. And
right.
they did exactly that.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
And God did exactly what? He overturned that
Exactly.
through the word.
This radical alternate, I always tell people, as you're reading the narratives, as you're studying, we read Genesis, a completely dysfunctional family from Abraham, right? We just like, oh. And how does God elevate and redeem the story? What does he do? How does he turn it upside down to what the natural order would be? Death, destruction, all the things that happen in families, estrangement, all that stuff. And, I'm always looking for what's that redeeming element in there? What is that radical alternative in the story? What is he trying to do? And that's not what you see in any of the other sort of stories of creation in any of the other cultures. You don't see that at all.
It's pretty just amazing story to me. And when you look at it from this perspective, it to me it's freeing.
Yes.
Um you know, I don't have to worry about all of these debates and things, because first off, I can't prove anything any more than anyone else can. Without the ability to time travel. And I've seen so many people, just you see these debates and no one walks out a winner. Everyone walks out thinking that they won. No one changes minds. But when you get down to it from this perspective, you start to see the underlying reason for these stories. And to me, at least, it gives hope, and it gives an understanding that God created the world in a way that's different from how we view the way of running. I don't know how else to say it. I'm like, it shifts your entire perspective on how the world is supposed to run.
Yeah.
You know, we live in a world that is still to this day obsessed with violence,
Mhm.
that thinks that the best way to silence a person is to kill
Right.
them. Um, and yet God shows that the power of a word is more powerful than any bullet can ever be.
I mean, straight out of the first verse, that sets the tone for the entirety of the Bible. That out of a word, out of breath comes life. Um, and we don't, because people aren't familiar with the ancient world and how the creation stories of the ancient world look. I mean, they're most of them are insane, right? You're just reading and going, "What on earth?" With these gods doing all this weird stuff, killing one another, and so that's the foundation upon which all the Bible rests, I think. And to your point, the world the history of mankind is just the history of violence over and over and over again to, authoritarian state tyrants, totalitarian. I mean, to maintain and keep things under control, you just kill your enemy. And like we just mentioned, I mean, and Yeshua being the ultimate enemy of of Rome, of the temple leadership, of Herodias, take your pick at the time. What does
Yeah.
God do? He does the ultimate radical, transformational to the world's understanding, and he resurrects Yeshua from the dead. Uh, kind of, okay, top that one. I don't think so. And I
Uh,
mean, and just the heart of God towards towards the human, the value and dignity that He gives to the human being is transformational also in the world around them. And you just go compare to how humans are, basically treated like trash to be thrown out in relationship to the gods, and yet God is this God who gives into the heart of humans the ability to innovate, to create, to be artistically creative, to create beauty, to produce, and be fruitful and multiply, and just this freedom through flourishing, just their uniqueness, their exceptionalism. If we could just tap into those things and recognize that every human has been given that gift to, to
yeah.
advance the cause of humankind, versus what we're seeing. It just feels like now everything's just in this state of decay and depravity. Just, I know it's not, but just spend one day looking at the news and you're just so depressed. But it feels like everything is just in this sort of vile state that is in a decaying state. I don't know. I have to tap into, back to the creation story.
Well, and that's why I think these stories are so powerful, is because when we see that entropy, right, that decay, we see that God is the one who forms order out of decay. He forms order out of chaos. And so it does give us hope that even when things are getting bad, or perhaps at the moment when things are getting bad, um, that's when his light shines the most, that he has the most ability to bring order. And maybe it is him in some way who is being the chaos bringer
Yeah.
again, you know?
Well, and I think the key in all of
Um,
this is hope. I mean, that was the whole purpose of apocalyptic literature, written in a very weird
yeah.
way, but the bottom line point of it was to give hope. And honestly, when hope is destroyed, I mean, as a human, there's nothing left. I mean, that level of uh, I mean, people end up in it's just such a state of despair, depression, when all hope is lost. And so really, I think that the main thread of the Bible really is God. God brings hope to every situation because He has the ability to restore order out of everything, and everything you're going through, every hard time, every challenge, all that human life is. He can always bring hope and restore order.
Right. Well, I'm going to save some stuff for the next one. I'm sitting here looking at the table of contents, and I think we actually probably covered a couple of the chapters of your early work. So, but I definitely want to, on our next time we meet, definitely want to dig a lot heavier into your book. And then just to tease that you guys who are listening, hoping to, on a third one, dig into, I know you covered on your final chapter, you covered a little bit of the book of Revelation, but you and I a while back did a really fun video called Revelation Unmasked. So we have a little bit of history on the book of Revelation. I think it'd be really fun to revisit that and look at it because I don't think we dug into it at all from the combat
Oh
myth
no, no, not at
perspective.
all. It was pretty
Um,
contextual,
so it,
really.
yeah, I think it'd be really fun because I've got some wild ideas out there too with Plato's cave. I don't know if we'll have time for all of that, but I've been digging into a lot of psychology in the Book of Revelation, so it'd be really fun to bounce some of that off of you.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure we can't do that one in about 35 or 40 minutes. But yeah, we'll save the best to last. Yeah, because that was kind of the sort of summary, if you will, of the book, to show the thread of the combat myth from Exodus. And really, I mean, that could have been, a 10,000 word book. There's just so much of language I didn't really get to go through the prophets. I mean, there's tons of combat myth there in the Kings. I mean, I had to just kind of focus. So it was really just Exodus and the Gospels.
All right, well, I'm looking forward to meeting up with you next time.
Absolutely. We'll
So
see
thanks.
you soon. Thanks for having me.
Thanks.